3 days before my son's funeral, I walked into Halloran's Florist on Magnolia Street to confirm the arrangements for the service. The woman behind the counter, a person I'd known casually for maybe 20 years, locked the front door behind me and turned the sign to closed. She put one finger to her lips and pulled me into the back room, where the cooler hummed and the smell of stargazer lilies was almost too much. She didn't say a word for a full 10 seconds. Then she whispered, "I don't know how to tell you this, so I'm just going to let you hear it for yourself. Stand here. Don't breathe loud." I thought she'd lost her mind. I really did. My son had been dead for 6 days. I had a black dress hanging in my closet and a eulogy I'd rewritten 4 times, and a heart that felt like wet cement. I didn't have room for whatever this was, but I stood where she pointed me, behind a curtain of dried eucalyptus, and I listened. The voices came from the other side of the wall, where the consultation room was. A man's voice, smooth and lazy, the kind of voice that's used to being agreed with. "She'll sign the release on Friday after the service. She won't read it. She'll be a wreck." Another voice, a woman younger, sharp. "And the autopsy?" The man again. "Cremation papers are already filed. By Saturday morning, there's nothing left to test." A third voice, older, professional, the kind of clipped tone a doctor uses when he wants to sound expensive. "I've signed the death certificate. Cardiac event. Clean. No one's going to question a 41-year-old man who ran marathons dying of a heart attack at home. His mother won't push for anything. She's not the type." That voice. I knew that voice. That was the cardiologist who'd been treating my son for the past 2 years for a heart condition I'd never quite understood. The man with the lazy voice was my son's business partner. The woman was my daughter-in-law. I don't remember the next part clearly. I remember the eucalyptus brushing my cheek. I remember the woman who owned the florist shop, whose name I'd later learned to say with more love than I'd ever said most names, reaching over and pressing her hand flat against my mouth. Not hard, just enough to remind me I was a witness, not a participant. I remember tasting the salt of her palm. I remember the cooler clicking on with a soft mechanical sigh. And I remember thinking very clearly the way you think when a car is sliding on ice, and there's nothing left to do but watch. My boy did not die of a heart attack. My boy was murdered. And these 3 people were planning to bury the evidence in an urn on my mantelpiece. When they left, when the bell over the front door chimed and the silence settled, the florist let go of my mouth. I sat down on a metal stool next to a bucket of white roses. She brought me a glass of water. She didn't apologize for grabbing my face. She didn't fuss. She just said, 3 weeks ago, your daughter-in-law came in to order the flowers. She and the business partner kissed in my parking lot. I saw them. They didn't see me. I've been sick about it ever since. Then today she came back with both men, and they asked to use my consultation room because the cafe across the street was too crowded. I let them, and I came around the back and I listened. I called you the second they said the word autopsy. I looked up at her. Her name was on her apron in cursive script, but my eyes wouldn't focus. I asked her why. Why would she risk this for me when she barely knew me? She said, "Because I lost my husband 22 years ago, and the man who killed him drove away clean. I am not going to watch it happen to another woman in my town, not while I have a back room and 2 ears." I drove home in a kind of trance. Magnolia Street was busy with the lunch crowd, a woman pushing a stroller, 2 old men arguing outside the barber shop, the sky doing nothing in particular. I held the steering wheel and I thought about my boy. His name had been the first word I ever spelled out loud to him when he was 3 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor with a box of alphabet magnets. He'd been 41 when they found him. His wife of 3 years called the ambulance at 11:14 on a Tuesday night. By midnight, he was gone. The hospital said, "Cardiac event." The cardiologist said, "Cardiac event." I said cardiac event over and over to anyone who asked because that's what they told me, and because I didn't know how to say anything else when I couldn't feel my own face. I want you to understand something before we go further. I am 67 years old. I was widowed at 52. My husband had a stroke at the kitchen table while reading the Sunday paper, and the boy you've been hearing about was 19 and away at college, and I drove 4 hours that night to tell him in person because I didn't want him to be alone with the news. For 15 years, it was just me and him, just the 2 of us. I sold the house in the suburbs and moved closer to the college so he could come home on weekends. I worked as a paralegal at a firm downtown until I retired at 63. I am not a wealthy woman, but I am not poor either. My husband left me comfortable, and my son had done well for himself. Very well. And he was an only child, and I was the only family he had on this earth, besides the woman who'd been planning his death in a flower shop while I was 3 days from putting him in the ground. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had stopped crying. I want you to mark that because it matters later. I had stopped crying and I was not going to start again until this was finished. If you've ever lost a child, if you've ever had your love poisoned by someone you trusted, please tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's sitting with me right now. The first call I made was not to a lawyer. It was to a woman I hadn't spoken to in 11 years, who used to work in the same firm as me, in the criminal defense side of the building. She'd left to become a private investigator after her own divorce. She picked up on the third ring. She said my name like it was a question, because we hadn't talked since her retirement party. I said, I think my son was killed. I have less than 72 hours before they cremate him. I need help and I need it tonight. She didn't say anything for about 4 seconds. Then she said, stay where you are. I'll be there in an hour. She lived 2 towns over. She made it in 47 minutes. While I waited, I went into my son's old bedroom, which I'd kept the same way for 15 years, even though I'd moved twice. I sat on the bed and I looked at the photos on the dresser. Him at 8 in a baseball uniform. Him at 22 in a cap and gown. Him at 38 on his wedding day, smiling at a woman I'd liked at the time. A woman I'd called my daughter twice in public and meant it. I thought about how she cried at the hospital, how she let me hold her, how she'd asked me to plan the service because she said she couldn't bear it. I thought about her kissing his business partner in a parking lot 3 weeks before he died. I thought about the cardiologist who'd been seeing my son monthly for what he'd called a mild arrhythmia. I thought about how my son had told me once, just once, that he'd felt strange after his evening tea. He'd laughed about it. He said his wife was probably trying to slip him a sleeping pill so he'd stop snoring. I had laughed too. When the investigator arrived, I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table the way we used to sit at the firm during late filings, except this time the file in front of us was my son's life. I told her everything from the florist's back room. I told her about the tea. I told her about the cardiologist, about the business partner, about the wife. She listened the way good investigators listen, which is to say, she didn't interrupt and she didn't react. When I was done, she said, we have 3 days. We need 4 things. We need the autopsy stopped from being canceled. We need a second opinion on the death certificate. We need bank records on all 3 of them. And we need someone in that wife's house who will let us in. I told her the wife had asked me to come help her clean out his closet on Thursday afternoon, the day before the service. The investigator looked at me for a long moment. She said, then you're going to be the one who lets us in. I did not sleep. I sat in my husband's old armchair from 1 in the morning until 5, and I listened to the house settle, and I made a list on a yellow legal pad of every small thing that had felt wrong in the last 6 months, and that I had explained away. The way my daughter-in-law had insisted my son switch from his old cardiologist to a new one she'd found through a friend. The way the business partner had started coming to family dinners and bringing wine and pouring it for everyone except my son, who didn't drink because of his medication. The way my son had grown quieter, more tired, more easily winded. The way he'd said to me on the phone 3 weeks before he died, Mom, I love you. Whatever happens, I want you to know I love you. I'd thought he was being sentimental. He had been a sentimental man. I had told him I loved him too, and then we talked about a Patriots game. 41 years old. A son tells his mother he loves her in a way that sounds final, and she talks about football. By 6 in the morning, the investigator called me back. She had already, somehow, in the few hours since she'd left, filed the request for an emergency hold on the cremation through a contact she had at the medical examiner's office. She said it would buy us 48 hours, but not more. She said she had a forensic toxicologist who would meet us at a lab in the next county at noon, and that we needed to bring something. A toothbrush, a hairbrush, anything personal of my son's that hadn't been touched by his wife. I told her I had his old retainer from when he was 16. I'd kept it in a drawer for 25 years for reasons I could never explain. The investigator was quiet for a second. Then she said, That'll do beautifully. I want to be honest about something. There was a part of me, a large part, that wanted to drive straight to my daughter-in-law's house at 6 in the morning and scream at her until she confessed or until I died of rage on her front porch, whichever came first. I wanted to grab her by her hair and tell her I had heard every word and that she would not get away with it. I sat in the armchair and I let myself imagine it. I let myself feel the whole shape of that rage, and then I put it down, because I knew, the way you know when a roast is done, that if I gave her even 1 second of warning, she would scrub the house, scrub the bank records, scrub the cardiologist, and I would be left with a flower shop owner's story and no proof. So I drank a second cup of coffee. I curled my hair, I put on lipstick, I drove to the lab in the next county with my son's old retainer in a sandwich bag in my purse. And then I drove to my daughter-in-law's house at 1 p.m, ready to help her sort through my son's shirts. And I hugged her at the door, and I let her cry on my shoulder. And I told her she was being so brave. The investigator and the toxicologist had a working theory by Wednesday evening. They said the heart condition my son had been treated for, the arrhythmia, was real. He'd had it for years. But the medication the new cardiologist had prescribed was unusual. Not wrong, exactly. Just unusual. And in combination with another substance, a substance that could be administered in something like, say, an evening cup of tea, that medication could induce a fatal cardiac event in a man with my son's history. And it would leave almost no trace. Almost, unless someone happened to test for it in the first 72 hours. The toxicologist needed access to the body. The investigator needed access to the cardiologist's prescribing records. And I needed to get into that Weiss house and find the kitchen. I spent 2.5 hours in that house on Thursday afternoon. My daughter-in-law was in the bedroom going through my son's ties and weeping in a way I no longer believed. I told her I needed a glass of water. I told her I needed a tissue. I told her I'd forgotten my reading glasses and had to look through her drawer for a spare pair. Did she mind? She didn't mind. I had a friend's elderly mother to play, and I played her well. In the kitchen I found, in the cabinet above the stove, behind a row of vitamin bottles, a small unmarked tin with a residue of dark green powder in the bottom. I took a photograph of it with my phone. I took a sample of the powder with the inside of a clean envelope I'd brought in my purse. I put the tin back exactly where I'd found it. I took a photograph of the prescription bottle on my son's nightstand, which she'd left there even though he was dead, which I now understood was because she had been told to leave nothing out of place that might trigger questions. I walked out of that house at 3:45 with my purse over my shoulder, and I told my daughter-in-law I would see her in the morning at the church. She kissed my cheek. I kissed hers back. My mouth has never been so cold. That night, the investigator brought a man to my house. He was a retired homicide detective who now consulted on cold cases and on what he called fresh ones that won't stay warm. He was somewhere in his late 60s, tall, soft-spoken, with the kind of patient eyes that had heard every story and believed about half of them. He looked through the photographs from the wife's kitchen. He looked at the prescription bottle. He looked at the sample of green powder. He said, "I know this powder. I've seen it twice in the last 5 years. Both times in suspicious deaths of men with cardiac histories. Both times in suspicious deaths of men with cardiac histories. Both times the wife inherited. Both times the case was closed as natural causes because no one tested in time." He set the envelope down. He said, "Your boy makes 3. And these 2 won't be 3 out of 3 if we move tonight." We moved that night. The investigator's contact at the medical examiner's office accepted the toxicology evidence at 10:30 in the evening. By midnight, the cremation was officially blocked, on the record, by court order. An autopsy was scheduled for Friday morning at 7, which gave the forensic team exactly enough time to find what they were looking for before the service began at 11. The detective made one phone call to a friend in the district attorney's office, a woman he'd worked with for 20 years. By 2 a.m, 3 search warrants were in motion. One for the wife's home, one for the cardiologist's office and prescription records, one for the business partner's financials. The detective asked me what I wanted to happen at the funeral itself. He said we could call it off. We could move the service. We could pull my daughter-in-law aside that morning and arrest her quietly. He said, "It's your call. He was your boy." I sat with that question for almost an hour. I thought about every grieving widow I had ever seen in my life. I thought about the way my son had looked in his coffin, with his hands crossed and his hair combed the way he'd worn it in high school, because nobody had told the funeral director he'd changed his part in his 30s. I thought about 120 people coming to a country church to weep over a man whose murderers were going to stand in the front pew and let themselves be comforted. And I thought about what my son had said to me. "Whatever happens, Mom, I want you to know I love you." He had known. I am sure of it now, the way I am sure of my own breathing. He had known something was wrong, and he had not been able to figure out how to tell me, and he had said the only thing he could say. I told the detective I wanted the service to happen. I told him I wanted the eulogy I had written. I told him I wanted them in that front pew, and I wanted them to hear every word I had to say about my son before I let the world know what they had done. He nodded once. He said, "That's a hard thing to ask of yourself." I said, "I have been asked harder." The Friday morning of my son's funeral, I woke up at 4. The autopsy began at 7. By 9, the forensic team had what they needed. By 10, I had a phone call from the detective confirming that the substance in the tin I'd photographed matched a compound found in my son's tissue samples in concentrations consistent with administered, not accidental, exposure. At 10:15, the cardiologist's office was being searched by 2 officers in plain clothes who'd been told to be quiet about it. At 10:30, the business partner's bank records were being subpoenaed. At 10:45, I put on my black dress, the one I'd hung in the closet 6 days earlier, and I drove to the church. The service was at the same small white country church where my son had been baptized as an infant and confirmed at 13. The same minister, now in his late 70s, who had married my husband and me 46 years ago. 130 people in the pews. My daughter-in-law in the front, in a black dress and a small black hat, holding hands with her sister, who had flown in from somewhere out west. The business partner 2 rows back with his own wife, who I now realized had probably had no idea, and who I now felt sorry for. The cardiologist had not come. I would learn later that he had been at his office trying to shred files when the officers walked in. The minister gave a short homily. He spoke about my son the way you speak about a man you watched grow up, kindly and a little awkwardly. Then it was my turn. I had not told the minister I wanted to speak. He looked surprised when I stood up. So did everyone else. The mother of the deceased rarely gives the eulogy in our tradition, because she is not expected to be able to. I walked to the front of the church. I put my hands flat on the wooden lectern. I looked at my daughter-in-law in the front pew. She smiled at me, sad and brave, the smile of a young widow being looked at by her dear mother-in-law. I smiled back. I told them about my son's first word, which was bird. I told them about the time he caught a frog at the lake when he was 6 and named it after his grandfather and tried to bring it into the cabin. I told them about his father's funeral when he was 19 and how he'd held my hand through the entire service and not let go until we were in the car. I told them about his college graduation. I told them about the day he called me to say he was getting married and how I'd cried and how I'd thought I was crying because I was happy. I told them about the last phone call we'd had 3 weeks before he died. I told them what he'd said. Whatever happens, Mom, I want you to know I love you. I let those words sit in the room for a long moment. And then I said, I thought he was being sentimental. I thought my boy was just being his sentimental self. I did not understand until 3 days ago that my son was saying goodbye. The church got very quiet. My daughter-in-law's smile flickered. Just for a second. Just enough. I said, I would like to thank the woman who owns Halloran's Florist on Magnolia Street, who is sitting in the back of this church right now, for being the only person in this town brave enough to tell me the truth. Heads turned. The florist stood up slowly in the back pew, her hands folded in front of her, and she nodded to me and she sat back down. I said, I would like to thank a former colleague of mine, a private investigator and a retired homicide detective, and a forensic toxicologist, all of whom have not slept since Tuesday. I said, I would like to thank the medical examiner's office for halting the cremation that was scheduled for tomorrow morning. My daughter-in-law's hand had gone still in her sister's. The business partner 2 rows back had gone the color of cold ash. I said, my son did not die of a heart attack. My son was poisoned. My son was murdered by the woman he married, with the help of his business partner, who had been sleeping with her for at least 6 months, and a cardiologist who had been paid to prescribe a medication that would interact fatally with what she put in his evening tea. The autopsy was completed at 9 o'clock this morning. The cardiologist is currently being questioned. The business partner's bank records are being subpoenaed, and there are 2 officers waiting in the parking lot of this church for the service to end. I have never in my entire life heard a room get so quiet. My daughter-in-law stood up. She said my name and her voice broke, and she said, Mom, please. I looked at her. I said, don't ever call me that again. She tried to walk out. She got halfway down the aisle and the doors at the back of the church opened, and the 2 officers stepped inside, and they did not raise their voices or rush, because they did not have to. The business partner stood up too, and his wife, his own wife, slapped him so hard across the face that the sound echoed off the rafters. The minister, my old friend, sat down in the front pew and put his head in his hands. I gave the rest of the eulogy. I want you to know that. I finished what I had to say about my son. I talked about the kind of laugh he had which came from somewhere deep in his chest and made strangers smile in restaurants. I talked about how he loved his father even after 15 years without him. I talked about the bird he had been at 3 years old, peering out of the kitchen window saying that one word over and over. I did not cry. I would cry later. I would cry for weeks. But I would not cry in that church, in front of those people, with my son in a box behind me and his killers walking out in handcuffs. I would not give them my tears. They had taken enough. The trial was 9 months later. My daughter-in-law was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The business partner was convicted of conspiracy and accessory. The cardiologist took a plea deal in exchange for testifying against the other two, and even with the deal he received 12 years and the permanent loss of his medical license. The detective, who had become a friend by then, sat next to me every day of the trial and brought me a thermos of soup at lunch because he said I'd stopped eating. The investigator sat on my other side. The florist sent flowers to my house every Friday for a year. White roses and stargazer lilies with a small card that just said, "Still here." I kept every card. I have them in a drawer in my kitchen now. I look at them sometimes. It took me a long time to understand why my son had married her. It took me longer to understand why he had stayed, even after, I now believe, he had begun to suspect. The detective and the investigator helped me piece it together. The wife had isolated him slowly, the way these things happen, the way a slow tide moves a boat. She had pushed him away from his old friends, away from his old doctor, away from the parts of his life that had been steady. She had made him doubt his own body. She had made him doubt his own mother, a little in the last year, in small ways I'd felt, but had not named, and she had done it all while smiling at me across the dinner table and calling me Mom. I will be untangling that for the rest of my life. I will be wondering for the rest of my life if I could have seen it sooner. I have decided mostly that I could not have, but there is a small part of every mother that always thinks she could have. That part of me will never quiet down completely, and I have made my peace with that. I have made my peace with most things now. I am 67 years old. I live alone in a small house with a garden I tend to most mornings. I see the florist for lunch twice a month. I babysit the detective's grandchildren on Saturdays sometimes when his daughter has a shift at the hospital. I go to my son's grave on the first Sunday of every month, and I sit there for an hour and I talk to him the way I used to talk to him on the phone. I tell him about my week. I tell him about the tomatoes I'm growing. I tell him that I heard him, that I heard the last thing he said to me, even when I didn't understand it, and that I listened, finally, when a stranger pulled me into a back room and told me to be quiet for 10 seconds and pay attention. I tell him that I love him. I tell him every time, if you've stayed with me this long, I want you to do something for me. I want you to call the person you love most in the world tonight, and I want you to tell them you love them, even if you're not the kind of person who says it, even if they aren't either, even if it's going to sound strange, because I will spend the rest of my life grateful that my son told me one more time before someone he should have been able to trust put something in his tea. I will spend the rest of my life knowing that he said it on purpose, the way a man says goodbye when he can't say goodbye, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve having heard it. The people who hurt us are sometimes the people we let into our kitchens. The people who save us are sometimes the people we barely know. Pay attention to both. Tell me in the comments, honestly, what you would have done if you had heard those voices through a flower shop wall 3 days before you buried your child. Would you have walked out and waited for justice to come in its own time? Or would you have sat in your kitchen at 1 a.m. and made the list I made? There is no wrong answer. I only know what I did. And I only know that my boy, somewhere, knows that his mother hurt him. I have thought about this every morning for almost 2 years now, while I tend the small patch of tomatoes my son helped me plant the spring before he died. I have thought about how a stranger, a woman who barely knew my name, became the reason I am still able to look at his photograph without flinching. And I have thought about how the people who shared my son's last name, his bed, his bank account, his medical chart, were the same people who put something in his evening tea and waited for him to stop breathing. The thing I want you to take from all of this is that love does not protect you from being seen clearly. Love only protects you from wanting to see. My daughter-in-law smiled at me across 40 Sunday dinners. She called me Mom in front of waiters and in front of my friends, and I let myself be flattered by it. And I told myself the small things that felt wrong, the wine she kept pouring for everyone but my son, the new cardiologist she insisted on, the way my boy grew tired faster than a 40-year-old man should, were just the small frictions of any marriage. They were not. They were warnings. I had every piece I needed to see it. I just did not want to. That is on me. I will carry that piece of it until I die, and I have decided to carry it without letting it crush me, because crushing myself will not bring my son back, and it will not honor what he tried to tell me on the phone 3 weeks before the end. The cause and the consequence in this story are not complicated. A woman wanted money and freedom, and another man, and she found 2 men willing to help her, and she chose the easiest path, her 41-year-old husband's body. That is the cause. The consequence is that she will spend the rest of her useful years in a state prison, and the man who took her into his bed will spend a decade in the same system, and the doctor who swore an oath and broke it will never touch another patient. The consequence came because a florist who had grieved her own husband 22 years before refused to let another woman in her town go through what she had gone through. One person's courage, multiplied by my willingness to sit in a kitchen at 1 a.m. and write a list instead of breaking down, was enough to bend the entire outcome. That is the lesson, if there is one. Be the kind of person who tells the truth even when it is not your truth to tell. Be the kind of person who, when someone hands you that truth, does not waste it on hysterics. Honesty is a kind of strength. Patience is a kind of strength. Refusing to scream when screaming would feel better is a kind of strength. And paying attention, real attention, to the people who love you, and the people who claim to, is the only protection any of us has in this life. I am 67 years old. I lost my husband at 52 and I lost my son at 67, and I am still here, tending tomatoes, taking lunches with a woman who used to be a stranger, telling the truth in places where it cost me something. If you are still listening, please be a florist for someone. Someday, a mother in your town is going to need one.